Hello everybody, I've got a really exciting game to show you today. This game was played in 1912 between Edward Lasker and George Thomas. Now there have been varying reports of the exact move order, the opening, and the exact moves, because there are multiple choices near the end of the game, but this is the most reliable set of moves that I've been able to find online, so I am aware of differing accounts on this game. Anyway, this is a very, very tactical game, and it started with d4, and Thomas played e6, and here most players might play e4, sort of kind of transposing into a French defence, or c4 is also very popular here. And then with black playing d5, that could go into a Queen's Gambit, either accepted or declined, Catalan, that sort of thing. But in this game, Lasker played knight f3, and f5 was played. So we have a sort of Dutch position here. And one idea of the Dutch is to play knight f6 and get your knight to e4. And play d5 as well, sort of clamping down on e4. It's known as a Stonewall Dutch, which can be very, very hard for white to break down. It's usually quite drawish, but sometimes black can go for broke and try and win. And the other idea is just to use black castle kingside and use the f file for the rook. Later on, maybe push with f4. And one final idea is just to throw all the pawns up on the king side later on. So white usually goes for central control and sometimes attacks on the queen side to counter black's initiative on the king side. But in this game, Lasker played knight c3, knight f6, and pin, bishop g5. So the idea is to take away black's control of the light squares by pinning the knight. And after black gets out of the pin, Lasker actually exchanges here with bishop takes, bishop takes. So what he is probably thinking is that because the position will be quite closed up, maybe the knights will be better. On the other hand, though, with his next move of e4, that might not have been what he was thinking at all. It might have been that he wants to use the light squares himself and try and break out very aggressively, and that the knight on f6 was preventing the move e4. So he's removed that piece and has played it. So he now has an initiative already at this point. e5 and d5 are both threats. And the bishop on f6 might not be very useful at the moment in this position. It's not really able to attack much. And at this early point of the game, white's knights are probably a little better than black's bishop. And if I was playing black, I would play d5. So I can see that the game could be opened up pretty quickly if I took, which we'll look at in a moment. But I think here I'm underdeveloped, so what I'll do is I will make white's pawn move, and if white takes, I'll recapture. And then maybe he'll maneuver with the bishop and stop me playing knight c6, which is something I would want to play. But after we both castle, I know that white is maybe a tiny bit better due to superior development, but in this position, which is quite closed up, often development isn't that important because there aren't any crazy tactics coming up. So I think I'd be quite comfortable here as black. So yeah, this would be the position I would probably go for. Well, white is only a little bit better. But in the game, what black did was take on e4. White now recaptured. So already white has got a knight in the centre and a pawn on one of the central squares, and black doesn't have any pieces directly in the centre, and that bishop feels like it's not really influencing the centre very much. So I really like white's position already, and Thomas played a move which I don't think is actually very good. He played b6, and the reason I don't think this is good is that he's already slightly behind in development, and he's taking two moves to actually develop one piece, b6, bishop b7. Okay, alright, the bishop's on a good square, but what I would have done first is I would have developed my knight to attack d4. And the reason for that is that it's controlling two very important squares. It's stopping white from putting the knight on e5, which would be a very strong position for the white knight. And it's also preventing white's move of bishop d3, which I think is the best square for the bishop. And the reason it's preventing that is because the pawn on d4 would not be protected by the queen anymore. So black could just capture on d4 twice. So knight c6 I feel is better, and then afterwards, perhaps the knight could stay on c6 for a little while, and black could castle, and then after, say, bishop b5, which is probably the best move, black could castle. White might take to inflict double pawns on black. If not, I think black is still fine. Black might capture towards the centre and doesn't want to have an isolated pawn after d takes. White might castle, and then black could, say, play bishop a6 to put the bishop on a good square. Rook would move, and maybe after rook b8, I think that white might be, again, a tiny bit better, but I'm not even sure if white is better here. I think black has got a decent position. So that's how I would have played it as black, because knight c6 is a more direct developing move. But b6 was played, and white now played knight e5. So white now has two pieces in the centre plus a pawn, and it's hitting so many squares in the centre. And the reason that you are meant to castle quickly in the Dutch, or not have a position like this, and not let white open it up, is because the diagonal h5 to e8 is quite weak. So black now needs to do something about the slightly exposed king. So black castles, and white now plays bishop d3. So the two moves that knight c6 cut out have now both been played by white. And here I would have alarm bells ringing if I were black, because the knight on e5 and the knight on e4 are both influencing lots of squares in both the centre and on the king's side, and that bishop on d3 is aiming straight at h7, so watch out for maybe sacrifices on h7 with the bishop, or worse, on h7. So I don't like black's position because the rook on f8 is hardly a good defender of the king. The bishop on f6 is a bit of a spectator, and it isn't guarding h7, as it's the wrong bishop. And the queen on d8 is a spectator, it's not really doing much. So here I might now play perhaps bishop takes e5, because I feel that the bishop on f6 isn't doing enough, and the knight on e5 is doing too much for my comfort. After white takes back, perhaps knight c6, and maybe black can get out of this without too much trouble here. Queen h5, rook f5. I think black's fine. Black looks like that they might actually be winning. If knight f6, by the way, can you see what's wrong with knight f6? Trying to win the exchange? Yeah, black can play queen takes f6, which I find quite fun. And white is losing here. White will lose at least 2 pieces for a rook. If if queen takes f5 here, then black can play queen takes f5, bishop takes f5, e takes f5. So it's a bishop and a knight for a rook, and that's generally better for the bishop and knight. So going back, that is what I would have played if I was black. I would play bishop takes e5, but instead, after the move b6 has been played, bishop b7 is sort of an automatic move that you generally play. You're kind of on autopilot. So bishop b7 was played. Again, it's not the end of the world, but there should be alarm bells ringing. Queen h5. So now look, there are 4 pieces all on the attacking the king's side, 2 knights, the bishop and the queen. And black is still, in a way, black's behind in development. I know black's castled, but hasn't got the knight on b8 out yet. And white doesn't really need to castle at this point. Black doesn't have any initiative, and there's no checks at all. So white's king is safe at the moment. And here, I think, is the final chance to play bishop takes e5. And here, I think black might even be slightly better because of white's premature queen move. So if queen takes e5, knight c6 will win the pawn on d4. And if d takes e5, what would you play for black here? Well, I think you get minus 10 points if you play bishop takes e4. Don't swap off too much, because after white recaptures, white would be threatening the rook on a8 and also checkmating sequence with bishop takes h7 check. Let's just briefly show that. So if you defend the rook, white can play bishop takes h7, king h8, bishop g6 check, king g8, queen h7 mate. So that would be horrible. But instead, black can play rook f5, and now black's winning a pawn. And white might have a little bit of compensation for the pawn in terms of development, but I still would fancy black's chances here. So, yes, here. In this position, and in the previous few moves, I feel that black hasn't made use of the pieces as well as he could have done. He's now sort of behind in development. He's suffering from a nasty attack here, and needs to be very, very careful and precise. And what white has done is, even though queen h5 might not be the best move, white has sensed that the pieces that he has out, the 2 knights and the bishop, are qualitatively superior and positionally superior to black's pieces. And when you're better in terms of position, often tactics can occur. If you're winning strategically, tactics do seem to crop up rather a lot. So black played queen e7 here, which might not look like such a bad move. It does seem to develop something. But white now went in for tactics, and this is why I think this game is so brilliant. I'll give you 20 seconds. Can anyone see the move that white played here? Well, there's a speculative sacrifice here. Some of you might have actually worked out all the way to the end, which would be very impressive. Queen takes h7, check, going for the black king and just sacrificing the queen. King takes. And the reason I would seriously look at this move is because knight takes f6, double check, looks very strong for white. Again, making use of those two centralized knights that control so many squares. And black only has two options. If king h8, then a family fork and a checkmate with knight g6. It's quite nice, the two knights doing all the work. And king h6 was played in the game, and now this is a wonderful, wonderful bit of tactics here. Knight e to g4 check. Knight on f6 is closer to the king, so it makes sense to get in the piece that's further away from the king. So knight f g4 would have been less effective. And now the king can only go to g5. So what next? Yeah, both moves are actually acceptable. You need to throw in a check. You can't just let the king be. So f4 wasn't played in the game, but I quite like this sequence. King h4 is the move that delays mate for as long as possible. g3 check, king h3, and there are two checkmates, or more here. But so yeah, two checkmates, but I like this one more, castles. And there is absolutely nothing black can do to prevent knight f2 checkmate. So very, very nice finish. But black did not play. White did not play f4 check. White played h4 check. And black now has to play king f4. g3 check. Again, don't let the king be. Keep on checking. Keep using pieces. So king f3. And here, actually, what was played in the game was bishop e2 check. But there's actually a faster checkmating sequence. Can anyone see how white can checkmate black in two moves? Again, I'll give you about 20 seconds. Okay, well, one way of checkmating is castles, and then there's no defense against knight h2 mate. So if queen takes knight, knight h2 checkmate. Okay, but in the game, bishop e2 was played, and I think this is a fantastic finish. King g2, rook h2, king g1, and final move of the game, king d2 mate. Castle's queenside would also be a very nice finish as well. But I think this is just fantastic, white using all their pieces to checkmate black, and black is still not developed at all really in this game. It's just the queen really that's moved, and okay, the rook that was used to castle with. So just to quickly go over the game, go back to the beginning. d4, e6, knight f3, f5, knight c3. So after knight f6, white's already ahead in development in terms of how many pieces they have out. White has two knights and a central pawn, whereas black only has one knight and a central pawn. The f5 pawn is sort of an extra pawn that's out, doesn't really need to be. So already black should be thinking, how do I quickly castle and either block up the position to make development less of a factor, or how do I quickly catch up in terms of development? So this is okay. And after e4, again I would play d5 to block the position, but f takes, knight takes is still just about okay for black. But again, I would now be thinking develop as fast as I can. So knight c6 is much stronger, and generally the bishop on the light squares in these type of Dutch positions often isn't really that useful. It's quite passive and isn't really a good piece. So playing bishop b7 after b6 would be a good way of activating the bishop and making it better than usual, but it just takes up too much time. Playing knight c6 and then maybe castles, and only then looking at the light squared bishop would be a better order of moves and plan. So b6 is still just tenable. Knight e5 might not be the strongest move, perhaps bishop d3 immediately, but again, maybe it's not that much of a difference. Castles, because queen h5 is being threatened, so black castles. Bishop d3. So again, black is behind in development, and again, probably should just take on e5. Get rid of white's superior knight in terms of quality to his bishop. And now, yeah, here was the last chance. Because again, white's pieces are coordinating so well, and black's pieces just aren't really working well together, and it's quite clear that white has a positional advantage. So what black again should do is reduce white's advantage by swapping off pieces, and that will reduce the attack and give him a little bit of breathing space. And here, as you saw, queen h7 was played, but one of the reasons it works so well is because of the coordination and position and sort of superior strategy that white has had up to this point. If black had even developed the knight to, say, c6, it would have been a lot harder for white to carry out this idea. But here, the rest, as you saw, is just a king hunt. And because black's pieces weren't defending the king, really, they're not in any way coordinating with the king side of the board, black's king is just helpless, and he alone fights against the whole white army, which doesn't work out too well, as you saw in the game. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video, and comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.